What's me too, capital G here, talking about Pot of Avarice in this video and asking the question, do you believe that this card could be unbanned and placed at limited status in the TCG? And before I really dive into this topic, I just want to address something that I know is going to come up because it always comes up when somebody talks about a card being unbanned. It's really the people who just defaultly say, no, Cap G, it's too risky, and it feels like they use that logic based on nothing but the risk. And my thing is, well, if you're going to use that logic, then can't you apply that to basically any card and any time anybody thinks about any card coming off of the ban list? Because there's always some level of risk when a card comes back, but I would like to think that you take other factors into consideration, because even when you look at cards that came back and really didn't have that big of a meta effect, TSUKUYOMI, Magician of Faith, Thousand Eyes Restrict, those cards were banned at some point for a legitimate reason. But if your whole argument is just risk, well, yeah, I mean, there was some risk unbanning TSUKUYOMI, but we see how that turned out. The card really didn't do that much. So anyways, let's go ahead and talk about Pot of Avarice. And this video is not just about Pot of Avarice, but it's actually about the structure of the card and the power level between it and, I guess, its common brother, or a very similar card to Pot of Avarice. For starters, I don't generally like to use the OCG as the gospel. Like, I'm not trying to say the OCG is the holy grail and everything that they do is perfectly right. Actually, Nim, he made a video about MAXX and he kind of made this same point. Like, I don't want to put the OCG on a pedestal or anything, but the card is currently semi-limited in the OCG, and as far as I can tell, nobody really plays Pot of Avarice over there, or at least we can find some common ground in this. It's definitely not a card that's warping their meta. It's not a card that has the player base in arms saying, get this card out of the game. It's not even having the MAXX or the Ash Blossom effect, where you basically run as many copies of those cards as possible, or as allowed by the ban list. You guys know that the second they hit that January 1st, 2018 ban list and MAXX moves from 2 to 3, every OCG player is going to add another copy of MAXX in their, decks, and basically you're going to have MAXX and Ash Blossom fighting for who is the most played card in the OCG. So the point that I'm making here is Pot of Avarice is legal somewhere in Yu-Gi-Oh, and nobody really cares. It's not really doing anything at all. And for anybody saying, no, Cap G, this card too broken, keep it banned, I'll actually give you this. I think I'm making this argument at a very bad time, because I think that certain eras of Yu-Gi-Oh are obviously better and worse for Pot of Avarice. Pot of Avarice got banned during the 5Ds era because it was kind of at a time where we actually started playing extra decks. If you guys don't know, basically until Gladiator format, like when Gladiator Beast came out and Gladiator's Assault and Light of Destruction, in that time, we really, most Yu-Gi-Oh decks didn't even play extra decks, so it became so much easier to fill your graveyard up with Pot of Avarice. When the Synchro mechanic came out and you had things like Rescue Cat and Summoner Monk, that sometimes you could get 3-4 monsters in the graveyard at a time. You guys know that if you link spam, obviously you can fill your graveyard up extremely fast. So when we have mechanics that kind of require monsters to go to the graveyard really quickly, Pot of Avarice is going to be able to shine more. Like, I don't think Pot of Avarice really would have done all that much during the Zexal era, because the materials stay under the Xyz monster, and sometimes you might keep those materials on the cards for a little while. And then obviously in Arc V we got pendulums, and those don't even go to the graveyard ideally. So those are mechanics that don't really benefit from Pot of Avarice all that much, but the new mechanic obviously does. But here's why I don't think that actually matters. And conventional wisdom would tell us that pulling off Pot of Avarice right now should be easier than it ever was at any point in Yu-Gi-Oh, because summoning links is obviously easier for the most common deck than summoning the other mechanics, because basically all you need is any form of monsters or tokens, and somehow you can convert those into links generally. And if you think that, oh, Cap G, I'm just gonna link spam all over the field, then I'm going to activate my Pot of Avarice, I'm gonna get my 2 cards, and GG, there's no way you can win. You're absolutely right, but you're still missing the point. The point that I'm making is you're not actually winning because of the Pot of Avarice. Like, you're winning because of the link spam, and the Pot of Avarice in that situation, when you take it in context of link spamming, is fairly inconsequential to who wins the duel. Like, let's take the best 2 link spams, or as I like to call them, hyperlink decks in the game, right? Let's take Spirals and World Chalice, inarguably the best 2 hyperlink decks in the TCG. So if you pop off with Spiral, and you get your Sleeper on board with your Tri-Gate Wizard and your Firewall, and then you activate like Pot of Avarice, those two cards in your hand are fairly inconsequential. If I can't play through your field, I basically lose anyways, and those fields have shown themselves to be incredibly difficult to play through. Same thing happens with World Chalice. If you have a Game of Seal with Kaiju Waterfront on the field and it's got like 4 counters, okay, you've got a walking Solemn Judgment, that's cool. You probably are going to have a Tri-Gate and a Firewall as well. Like if I can't play through that field, it doesn't matter if you have 8 more cards in your hand or if you have 0, you're still going to win the duel anyway. So at that point, activating Pot of Avarice after you've already link spammed or on the field, it basically becomes icing on the cake, not the actual cake. And that actually leads me to my next problem with the whole argument of if I link spam off and then activate Pot of Avarice, then I'll basically win the game. You're only looking at Pot of Avarice in a best case scenario. You probably need to be thinking about it more realistically. Like, let's look at the metagame like this in the TCG. Most decks in our metagame run at least a couple of purple traps, whether it be evenly matched or just reincarnations or something. And most decks, because of the state of our game, run at least a couple of hand traps, even if it's just a couple of Ghost Ogres and a MAXX or something like that. So let's put you in a situation where maybe you go first, which is fairly common. You open up with a hand trap, a purple trap, and a Pot of Avarice. What exactly are you doing with that Pot of Avarice? Because unless the other 2 cards in your hand are just the perfect combination, that Pot of Avarice sure as hell is not going to facilitate whatever it is your deck wants to do. For the most part, it's just going to sit in your hand because you won't be able to activate it. So what does it actually do in that situation? It might be a couple of turns before you actually get some value out of that card. And it actually takes me to my other point. It's about Pot of Avarice's biggest competition and instant gratification, and how important it's actually become in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And why I think that it's one of the biggest reasons why Pot of Avarice doesn't see that much play in the OCG. So you guys probably know where I'm going with this, but Pot of Desires is basically like Pot of Avarice's maybe little brother or something like that. And one of the reasons why the card sees so much play, and let's not argue about whether Pot of Desires is good at this point, sees play in the OCG, it sees play in the TCG. I would say right now, especially if you took out Spiral, because that does kind of skew the stats, like Pot of Desires is probably top 5 most played cards in the game. You don't become that high being a terrible card. Pot of Desires is instant gratification for a draw 2 card. Pot of Avarice is not. And I'm not saying again that you can't activate Pot of Avarice turn 1. What I'm saying is you can't just start turn 1 and then throw Pot of Avarice on the field and be like draw 2. No, there's obvious hoops that you have to jump through. And even though you do have to banish a quarter of your deck turn 1 with Pot of Desires, and it can be kind of sucky, it's a card that you can automatically activate, go +1, and have 2 more cards in your hand. And for a lot of players, that's just so much more appealing than a card that might be live and maybe I can activate, maybe I won't be able to activate. I mean, keep in mind that for the most part, guys, the same type of cards stop both of them. So if you put Pot of Avarice right now in the TCG, it still gets shut down by Ash Blossom. It still really gets shut down by kind of the same cards that shut down Pot of Desires in general. So you're not going to have any less cards stopping. And in fact, DD Crow used to be a common counter during like the 5Ds days for Pot of Avarice. But I think that instant gratification has become such a big deal in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it really seems like, believe me, Card of Demise is the card that proved it. As long as players can have instant gratification when it comes to drawing cards, players are willing to jump through any amounts of fucking hoops. Discard my entire hand during the end phase, no problem. Not be able to special summon, not being able to do damage, no problem, Konami. Give me my 3 fucking cards. That was proven time and time again with Card of Demise. Players were willing to jump through any amounts of hoops to get those 3 cards as long as they could get them instantly, and Pot of Avarice does not allow you to do that. It doesn't matter how much you look at the upside of Pot of Avarice, and believe me, this is me arguing for the card in the context of my Altergeist deck, where I would love to be able to put my Wind Witches back in my deck and have another shot at Ice Bill, but you can't just look at the ceiling of a card if you're going to ignore the floor of the card. And the floor of the card is possibly drawing at turn 1 and sitting around twiddling your thumbs 2 turns while you don't actually have the ideal situation to activate it. Maybe you don't have the monsters in the graveyard, maybe your opponent has banished your card somehow, etc., etc. I think you get where I'm saying. Pot of Avarice does have a card that is kind of directly in competition with it that is much faster than it. And actually, the last thing about instant gratification before I make my final point is I think that instant gratification, or you could really just call it speed, is the reason why cards like Shard of Greed and Pot of Dichotomy never saw a lot of historic meta play. I mean, if you look at Shard of Greed especially, this is a card that doesn't take away anything from you. I mean, it doesn't take away any of your phases. It doesn't take away your ability to do pretty much anything, and still people would not play this card. It was a secret rare and everything. People were just not willing to sit around for 2 full turns before they cashed in that +1. They weren't willing to do it. They wanted the cards now, and if they couldn't get them now, they weren't going to play the card. So the last thing I want to talk about is really the direct comparison between kind of the power of Pot of Desires and Pot of Avarice, because I think these cards are very comparable. If we can't agree on this, then I guess we can't agree on anything. I mean, this feels like Vegeta and Goku. These cards kind of do the same thing. They both give you a couple of cards. Obviously, Pot of Desires does it a lot faster in most cases. Pot of Avarice obviously makes up for that by giving you some of your resources back in your deck where you might want them. But the thing is, when you look at the places on the ban list for cards that basically operate similarly and kind of do the same thing, does it really make sense when the power of the cards are so similar that one of them is at 3 and the other is at 0? Because to me, that doesn't make any sense. Like, this is a situation, this is the best comparison I can make, right? Look at Lightning Vortex and look at a card like Raigeki. Lightning Vortex is a strictly worse version of Raigeki. In fact, Lightning Vortex, the entire purpose, the entire reason that card exists was so that they could have a replacement during the GX era, Flaming Eternity, for Raigeki when the card was actually banned. They wanted a weaker Raigeki, and at some point, Lightning Vortex was actually limited to 1 with like Diamond Dew Turbo and whatnot. But if you look at those cards, it makes 100% sense that Raigeki would be at 1 and Lightning Vortex would be at 3, because Raigeki is so much of a better card and they kind of do the same thing. If you look at something like Dark Hole and you look at Raigeki, even OCG, TCG, whatever, like those cards both being at 1 or even at 1 and 2, that kind of makes sense. Like, Raigeki is obviously stronger, but it's not so much stronger where it's like, yeah, Dark Hole should be at 3, Raigeki should be at 1. Would you really say the same thing? Like, the logic just seems like it kind of goes into, it seems like it falls off a cliff when you look at Pot of Avarice and Pot of Desires. These cards feel like they're basically at the same kind of power level, but one's at 3 and one's at 0, despite the fact that they kind of do the same thing. And it just, again, that doesn't really make any sense to me. But you guys ultimately let me know in the comment section below. Even if you don't agree with me, I just want to know why. I think I need a little bit more than no cap G, too scary. Unless you're Mimi, you can give me that answer then. And again, I don't really want to hear no, better, safe than sorry, because again, if you're going to use that logic, then don't ever move any card up the ban list ever, because, better safe than sorry. So anyways, whatever you guys thought, leave it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already. Turn on that notification bell for daily videos.